sisimulang salakayin ng Japan ang Manchuria. No, so ano po ang Manchuria? Ang Manchuria ay ang northernmost region ng China. So mula rito sa Manchuria na ito, papasok ang Japan sa China at magsisimula ang digmaan sa pagitan ng Japanese at ng Chinese, no, na kung saan for almost 10 years no ng labanan sa pagitan ng dalawang bansa na ito ay hindi naman tuluyang nasakop or nagapi ng Japan ang China. Okay, isa 'yon no sa bagay na nag isa yun sa bagay na nagko-contribute kung bakit minamaliit ng mga Western powers ang Japan, kasi itong Japan for more than 10 years na nilalabanan nito ang China, hindi nga ito magapi-gapi. Okay, sandali ah. Okay, so siguro para magkaroon tayo ng konting preview dito sa Japanese invasion ng Manchuria, let's watch this short documentary clip about their invasion of Manchuria. Saglit lang ha.
Accelerate your business success. Fujifilm Business Innovation. Nivea Men Cool Kick. Get instant icy cool feeling and all-day protection. The early 1930s, there's no way to...
Saglit ah. Parang mas maganda rito eh.
In this lesson, we're going to look at the Manchurian...
Okay. Ito na. You can turn off your camera while watching the documentary.
In this lesson, we're going to look at the Manchurian crisis of 1931, when Imperial Japan invaded the province of Manchuria in China. And we're going to ask, how did the League deal with this aggressive action? Let's have a little look at some Japanese history very briefly. For almost 1,000 years, Japan had been ruled by the shoguns, who were hereditary military dictators. There was an emperor, but real power lay with the shoguns. And the shoguns effectively cut off Japan from outside contact with the world. So Japan was very isolated. In 1853, this gentleman you can see in the black and white photograph, Commodore Perry, he was leader of an American expedition, the aim of which was to force Japan to open up to trade. This was a successful expedition. Essentially, Perry sailed 4 gunboats towards the capital Edo, and essentially threatened the Japanese with opening fire if they didn't accept the opening up of Japan. And this was ultimately successful. The Japanese recognized that Commodore Perry and the West had developed advanced military technology which they couldn't deal with. Here's a contemporary Japanese woodblock illustrating, I think Commodore Perry's in the middle there. And so what happened next is that Japan made huge and very successful efforts to change its economy, its infrastructure, and so on along Western lines. Use what's been used against you and develop that strength. So in 1868, the old shogun, remember the shoguns had kept Japan isolated, they're kicked out, and the emperor is restored in something called the Meiji Restoration. And the economy, the education, the industry of Japan, these are developed along the lines of Western models. So Japan, as a consequence, becomes an industrialized country. Japan shows its new power in the defeat of a Western power, in the defeat of Russia. In 1905, in the Russian-Japanese War, 2/3 of the Russian fleet was sunk at the Battle of Tsushima. The Japanese had modern steamships which they communicated effectively using new wireless technology, and so the Russians suffered a defeat at the hands of this new Asian power. And Japan expected equality after this with those Western empires. It wanted its own empire. After all, Britain, France, the Dutch, they had large empires within Asia, and Japan would like its own Asian empire. It needed raw materials for its manufacturing, for its industry. Japan was very poor in terms of raw materials like coal, oil, iron, these things that you need in a manufacturing economy. Japan was very short of them, so it wanted to conquer or colonize foreign territories to gain access to supplies of raw materials. The Western powers now began to see Japan as something of a threat. After all, the Western powers had interests in Asia. Many of them had colonies in Asia, and Japan now is a potential rival with the power to back itself up. Japan did actually support the Allies in World War I. It supported Britain, France, Russia, and the United States. But very much like Italy, as we'll see later, Japan was disappointed with what it got out of the Versailles Treaty. It expected more land and more territories. It was disappointed with this. Let's have a little look at the government of Japan leading up to the invasion of Manchuria. During the 1920s, there was a civilian, democratic government in Japan. However, the army held the real power. They kind of bossed the civilian government around and told them what to do. The army held the real power in Japan. And in September of 1931, the army demonstrated this in something called the Mukden incident. Essentially, the Japanese army claimed that its railways and its possessions in Manchuria were under threat, and it needed to march into Manchuria to restore order. This was essentially an excuse for an invasion of Manchuria, which was part of China. So in 1931, Japan invaded Manchuria, a large province of China. It's after raw materials, essentially, within Manchuria, and also a market for Japanese goods. So what did the League of Nations do? Was collective security going to work? Were the countries of the League of Nations going to act together and get this aggressive action, make it reverse? Were they going to force Japan out of Manchuria? Bit of a problem. Both China and Japan are members of the League of Nations. So what's the League going to do? This map is very helpful here, just to see where things are. So Korea had previously been colonized in 1911, 1912, and Japan invaded Manchuria, as you can see, in 1931. Manchuria, Manchukuo in Japanese, Manju, I believe, in Korean. So what did the League do? It's a picture of some Japanese troops on a troop ship there. Did it use economic sanctions? Remember, it could use the force of world opinion. It could use economic sanctions. It could use military force. Did the League do those things? Well, this is what the League actually did. It set up something called the Lytton Committee, led by Lord Lytton of Great Britain. Now, this committee had to make its way to Manchuria, which obviously took a long time, so they had to travel all the way from Western Europe to Manchuria. It took the committee a long time to make its report, so clearly there are some inefficiencies in the League here. It takes a very long time for the Lytton Committee to make its report, by which time the Japanese have effectively completed their conquest of Manchuria. So what did the Lytton Committee report say? The Lytton report said Japan should leave Manchuria, but did it back this up with any threats? No, there was no trade ban, nor was there a threat of military force. So how did Japan respond to the League of Nations report saying, look, you should leave Manchuria? Well, they did leave something, and that was the League of Nations. This is Matsuoka in a very dramatic moment in the League of Nations in 1933. Basically, Matsuoka says Japan finds it impossible to accept the report. This is a life or death thing for us. You know, you've got your empires. We are the new empire in the East. We're going to bring order and civilization in the East. And Matsuoka does make a fair point. There's slight double standards here in the great powers of Britain and France when they already have foreign empires which they've colonized previously. So basically, Japan leaves the League of Nations. Why was the League of Nations so weak, so indecisive in dealing with a case of aggression between two members of the League of Nations? You know, why didn't it deal with Japan's invasion of Manchuria? Well, missing powers are a factor. The USSR wasn't a League member. The USSR would certainly have opposed Japan's invasion of Manchuria quite strongly. In fact, Russia had previously had a claim on Manchuria, and the Japanese invasion of Manchuria is very close to Russian strategic interests, but the USSR wasn't a member of the League, so a potential ally in opposing Japan was absent. Probably even more important, the United States was not a member of the League because of its policy of isolationism, and this would mean that any economic sanctions that Britain and France and the League powers did wouldn't be effective because the USA could simply fill the trade gap. What is also going on is the Great Depression. And so any ban on trade with Japan is going to really hurt the economies of Britain and France and the other major powers at a time when they've got a lot of problems at home with the Depression. So not only are economic sanctions going to hurt the powers themselves, the USA would simply fill in the gap. So that's not going to make them effective. The USA could simply fill the trade gap. There were also some sympathetic powers who were watching what was happening in Manchuria with great interest. It's a picture of Benito Mussolini, the fascist dictator of Italy. Germany as well was looking on curiously. Remember, it wanted to reverse some of the terms of the Treaty of Versailles. Italy wanted a foreign empire, so it's very curious seeing what's going to happen here. Germany as well. Could Japan get away with it? So Italy and Germany looking on curiously, seeing how this is going to play out. Why didn't Britain and France take a more concerted action? Why weren't they stronger? And remember, Britain and France, they are principally the strongest members of the League. Britain's worried militarily. It's not powerful enough that its navy couldn't take on the Japanese. It doesn't want to start a war. It's also worried, you know, it can't take on a war on two fronts. Its big priority is looking after its empire, not fighting the Japanese, who've demonstrated they've got a modern and efficient navy. It is worried if it does take on the Japanese, can it defend its East Asian and Southeast Asian and South Asian colonies, India, Singapore, and Hong Kong? It doesn't want to risk its East Asian colonies. And like we said, it traded a lot with Japan, and that was important, especially during the Great Depression. Could it afford to lose that trade with Japan? The French, their principal concern from historical reasons is they were mostly worried about Germany. So they didn't want to commit foreign troops to a very far away conflict in an area. Manchuria was not really of any strategic interest to either Britain or France. So why would they spend money and potentially lose lives fighting Japan over this issue? So to summarize, the powers were weak. They were worried. They were focusing on the Great Depression. France was more worried about Germany. Britain was worried about protecting its empire, didn't want to get involved in a war with Japan. Important powers, the USA wasn't a member of the League and could simply have filled any trade gap. The USSR wasn't a member of the League, and so a potential ally against Japan was lost there. The Depression we've mentioned, again, countries, they're very wary about doing economic sanctions that are going to hurt them at home. And this is the first time, really, they've dealt with a very aggressive power which simply ignores what the League is saying. And the other factors in collective security, the League wasn't prepared to do them.
So kung makikita rin natin, no, bukod sa napaka-aggressive ng Japan bilang isang superpower that time, yung humaharap din sa iba't ibang krisis yung mga bansa sa Europa, kung kaya't hindi rin sila makagawa ng paraan para i-check or what do you call this, harapin itong Japan, no? Aside din sa minamaliit din nila itong Japan, yung military capacity ng Japan. Okay, so isa pa rito maaari nating tignan, no, sa pagpapalawak ng Japan noong mga panahon na yan, nung sinakop ng Japan noon ang Korea, no? The Japanese invasion and annexation of Korean Peninsula. Okay, saglit. Okay, so in 1910, basically Korea was annexed by the Empire of Japan after years of war, intimidation, and political machinations. The country would be considered a part of Japan until 1945. So naging bahagi ng Japan ang Korean Peninsula. At that time, wala pang North and South Korea but only the Korean Peninsula. Okay, I also have here a short video clip regarding the Japanese invasion in Korea. Saglit.
This is Japan, one of the most powerful countries in the world. This is South Korea, a country famous for smartphones, K-pop, and cosmetics. These two neighbors in East Asia, however, have never been in a good relationship over the past century. It was dated back to the early 20th century when Korea was annexed by the Empire of Japan after years of war, intimidation, and political machinations. Japan-Korea annexation. Korea became a protectorate of Japan in the Japan-Korea Treaty of 1905, and the country was indirectly ruled by the Japanese through the Resident General of Korea. In 1910, Japan formally annexed Korea by the Japan-Korea Annexation Treaty without the consent of Gojong, the regent of the Korean Emperor Sunjong.
Time to scout.
The Japanese had established the Korean Peninsula as an overseas colony of Japan, which was administered by the general government based in Kyoto, which was Gyeongsang in Korean. It governed Korea with a near absolute power. Japanese rule prioritized Korea's Japanization, accelerating industrialization started by the Gwangmu Reform, building public works, and fighting the Korean independence movement. Following the annexation, Japan set out to repress Korean traditions and culture, and to develop and implement policies primarily for the Japanese benefit. Its officials constructed European-style transport and communication networks across the nation in order to extract resources and labor. The banking system was consolidated and the Korean currency was abolished. The Japanese removed the Hosen hierarchy, destroyed much of the Gyeongbokgung Palace, and replaced it with the government office building. Korean uprisings. After Emperor Gojong died in January 1919, amidst rumors of poisoning, independence rallies against Japanese invaders took place nationwide 2 months later, which is also known as the March 1st movement. This movement was suppressed by force like other peaceful and pro-libertarian rallies in Korea. The March 1st movement was partially inspired by United States President Woodrow Wilson's speech of 1919, declaring support for the right of self-determination and an end to colonial rule after World War I. The Provisional Government of the Republic of Korea was established in Shanghai, China, in the aftermath of the March 1st movement, which coordinated the libertarian effort and resistance against Japanese control. Some of the achievements of the provisional government include the Battle of Qingshanli of 1920 and the ambush of Japanese military leadership in China in 1932. The provisional government is considered to be the de jure government of the Korean people between 1919 and 1948. Its legitimacy is enshrined in the preamble to the Constitution of the Republic of Korea. Approximately 2 million Koreans had participated in the more than 1,500 demonstrations. About 7,000 were massacred. 15,000 were wounded, and 56,000 were arrested by the Japanese police force and army, although Japanese records claim the participation of less than 500,000. Elimination of traditions and culture. Continued anti-Japanese uprisings, such as the nationwide uprising of students in November 1929, led to the Japanese strengthening their military rules in 1931. Following the outbreaks of the Sino-Japanese War in 1937 and World War II, Japan attempted to destroy Korea as a nation. The continuance of Korean culture itself began to be illegal. Worship at Japanese Shinto shrines was made compulsory. The school curriculum was radically modified to eliminate teaching in the Korean language and history. The Korean language was banned. Koreans were forced to adopt Japanese names, and newspapers were prohibited from publishing in Korean. Numerous Korean cultural artifacts were destroyed or taken to Japan. According to an investigation by the South Korean government, 75,311 cultural assets were taken from Korea. Korean Liberation Army and Japanese surrender. The Korean Liberation Army, established on September 17, 1940, in Chongqing, China, was the armed force of the Provisional Government of the Republic of Korea. It brought together many Korean guerrilla armies that proliferated in northern Korea, Manchuria, and mainland China during the 1920s. After the declaration of war by the Provisional Government against Japan and Germany on December 9, 1941, the units of the Korean Liberation Army participated on the Allied side in the Chinese and Southeast Asian theaters. From its humble beginnings with an officer corps of 30 men at its foundation, the Army grew to a substantial force with 339 in active service by the end of the war. Japanese rule over Korea ended on 15 August 1945, upon the surrender of Japan in World War II, and the armed forces of the United States and the Soviet Union occupied the territory. The division of Korea separated the Korean peninsula under two governments and economic systems, with the Northern Soviet Civil Administration and the Southern United States Army military government in Korea. Controversy. During World War II, Koreans at home joined or were forced to support the Japanese war effort. Hundreds of thousands of men were conscripted into Japan's military. Around 200,000 girls and women from Korea and China were forced into sexual slavery for Japanese soldiers, with the emphasis on comfort women.
New UFC Soup. Sarap na yung mayakap.
In the early 21st century, former Korean comfort women have continued to protest to the Japanese government and have sought compensation for their sufferings during the war. In 1965, the Treaty of Basic Relations between Japan and South Korea declared the unequal treaties between Japan and Korea, established in 1905 and 1910, were already null and void at the time of their promulgation. While Japan asserts that the treaty was concluded legally, Korea disputes this argument. The treaty was not signed by the Emperor of Korea as required, and it violated the International Convention on External Pressures regarding treaties. In March 2010, 109 of main Korean intellectuals and 105 of main Japanese intellectuals met in the 100th anniversary of Japan-Korea Treaty of 1910, and they declared this annexation treaty null and void. They declared these statements in each of their capital cities, Seoul and Tokyo, at the press conference. They announced, "The Japanese Empire pressured the outcry of the Korean Empire and people, enforced by Japan-Korea Treaty of 1910. And the full text of the treaty was false, and the text of the agreement was also false." Also, they announced the process and formality of Japan-Korea Treaty of 1910 had hugely deficiency and therefore this treaty was null and void. This meant March 1st movement was not an illegal movement. Japanese rule remains controversial in modern-day North Korea and South Korea, and its negative repercussions continue to affect these countries, including the industrialization plan to solely benefit Japan, the exploitation of Korean people, and the marginalization of Korean history and culture, the environmental exploitation of the Korean peninsula. What do you think about the Japanese occupation of Korea? Tell us in the comments.
Okay, so nakita natin doon yung isa sa mga way ng brutal na pamumuno ng Japan sa Korea. So, well, to cut the long story short, ilan yun sa mga sa mga naging event, no, na well, isa yun sa ilan yun sa mga movement na ginawa ng Japan to show their power, saka basically to expand their territory. Okay, so bahagi din, no, ng pag-expand ng kanilang teritoryo yung pag-atake ng Japan sa Pilipinas. Okay, so bahagi ito ng kanilang imperyo na tinatawag na Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. Pero bago tayo pumunta dun sa pag-atake ng Japan sa Pilipinas, tignan muna natin yung controversial din na pag-atake ng Japan sa Pearl Harbor. Kasi December 8, 1941, nung inatake tayo ng Japan, then before that, December 7 of 1941, umatake naman ng Japan sa Pearl Harbor. Ayan yung US naval base ng Amerika sa Hawaii, which would lead to the declaration of war ng US against Japan. Okay, saglit. Another documentary for the Pearl Harbor attack.
Aloha! We're in Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. Right over there, in 12 meters of water, lies a 185-meter ship in her final resting place. When Japanese naval aviation attacked the naval base at Pearl Harbor, the battleship Arizona took bomb hits and then became a tomb for 1,000 officers and men. Other American battleships were also sent to the shallow bottom. December 7th, 1941 is a tragic day in U.S. history. It was a day of defeat, but it also gave rise to a great victory, albeit at enormous effort and countless victims. Before that day, though, almost nobody in the world had heard of Pearl Harbor or Oahu.
The Hawaiian Islands are comprised of more than 20 islands and atolls. They are located in the northern part of the Pacific Ocean, almost in the middle between North America and Asia. The islands represent a very important strategic location for the USA, which is why they were annexed by the states at the turn of the 20th century.
Territory of Hawaii, as was the case in World War II, to be able to use that as a jump-off point for their Navy or Air Forces, and given the limitations of fuel capacity in the Second World War, a lot of airplanes didn't have the ability to fly from North America to Asia as they do today. So Hawaii was a way for a lot of that hardware to come to the central area of the Pacific and to be used in warfare.
At the very beginning of 1941, the commander of the combined Japanese fleet, Admiral Yamamoto Isoroku, stated his opinion that a sudden strike against the US fleet stationed at the Hawaiian Islands would inflict maximum damage to the enemy and buy Japan some time to capture the resource-rich territories that Japan badly needed. The mission seemed impossible. The Hawaiian Islands and Japan were separated by a distance of more than 4,000 miles. There was an entire chain of airfields on the island: Hickam, Wheeler, Ewa, Kaneohe, Halaiwa, and Bellows, all of which could launch aircraft to fend off an enemy attack.
This is the best remaining example of a Nakajima B-5N2 torpedo bomber. The Americans called it a Kate. And 142 of these aircraft were used on the raid on Pearl Harbor. During training exercises, it was observed that the torpedoes, after being dropped in shallow water, would simply embed themselves into the sea floor. But by autumn of 1941, a new development of the Type 91 torpedo was released. And this used a new angular acceleration control system that was unique in the world. Externally, what you would see would be these two fins here, which would be used for roll control. And also you can see on the tail the wooden panels that were added for better aerodynamics during the drop. They would detach upon hitting the water. But what this all meant was that the torpedo could now be used in the 17-meter depth of Pearl Harbor.
December 7th was not the original date. It was November 20th. And they had been training their pilots for months. The pilots for the torpedo planes and the fighter planes and the dive bombers had been in training specifically for at least 4 months for this operation. Operation Hawaii was a very big secret in Japan. Many of the pilots did not know the mission until they were assigned to the carrier and were actually practicing. Some of them were practicing not knowing exactly what the target was at the time. There was an entire ordnance secrecy also.
For a long while, the Japanese lacked a bomb capable of penetrating the thick armor of US battleships, but they set their engineers to the problem. The solution they came up with was quite novel. You start with an obsolete 410mm battleship round, you repurpose it to become an aerial bomb, and suddenly the Japanese now have a new highly capable form of ordnance, as in particular USS Arizona would discover.
The fate of Pearl Harbor was decided at the beginning of November 1941. On November 4, the command structure of the Imperial Japanese Navy approved the mission plan, and the 5th Commander of the Combined Japanese Fleet issued Combat Order 1 for the attack on Pearl Harbor. 2 days later, Admiral Yamamoto approved the final date of the attack, Sunday, December 7.
And in fact, it was determined by a very prominent Japanese spy who worked at the Japanese consulate on Oahu that Sunday morning would be the absolute best time to attack. And that's why they planned it, because he knew that the surprise element would be magnified so much.
On November 22, all 30 ships of the task force had gathered in Hitokapu Bay on Iturup Island. 6 aircraft carriers, 2 battleships, 3 cruisers, 9 destroyers, 3 submarines, 7 oil tankers. The carriers had the following aircraft on their decks: 40 torpedo bombers armed with torpedoes, 135 dive bombers, 104 torpedo bombers armed with bombs, 129 fighters. 408 aircraft in total.
There were many difficulties in planning this and what they actually experienced when they came across. One was the heavy seas, the pitching of the aircraft carriers during the weather for launch and takeoff. The other was they were under a radio blackout, so they very minimal kind of communications, much of it just conning tower to conning tower, kind of light signals and flags.
The last radio message received by the Japanese staff from their assets at Honolulu came from a spy, Takeo Yoshikawa. The message read as follows. Vessels moored in harbor. 9 battleships, 3 Class B cruisers, 3 seaplane tenders, 17 destroyers. Entering harbor are 4 Class B cruisers, 3 destroyers. All aircraft carriers and heavy cruisers have departed harbor. No signs of any changes in U.S. fleet or anything unusual. The Japanese staff were disappointed to hear that there were no aircraft carriers at the base, but they did not cancel the operation.
The ships were blacked out and set a course to Oahu Island at full speed. The famous signal flag Z was raised on the mast of the Japanese flagship, aircraft carrier Akagi. The flag is one of the most treasured relics of the Japanese Navy. 36 years prior, when this signal had appeared on armor-clad Mikasa, it symbolized the legendary order that Admiral Togo had delivered to his fleet before the Battle of Tsushima broke out. The fate of the Empire rests on the outcome of this battle. Let every man do his utmost duty. On December 7, 1941, that order was delivered again to every serviceman who set out on that dangerous raid. In addition to an airborne attack by Japanese deck aviation, the Hawaiian Islands were also subjected to an attack by submarines deployed near Oahu Island. They were ready to destroy any U.S. ship that attempted to flee from the harbor during the aviation attack. Moreover, 5 of the Japanese submarines carried midget 2-man submarines on their decks.
Hawaii, of course, remained in a state of blissful ignorance, and the parties continued on into the night. Even the radio station, if you happened to turn it on, was playing a series of light and amusing tunes.
It was a Sunday, and a lot of ships had actually been prepared before December 7th on Saturday for an inspection on Sundays. A lot of the normally functioning battle spaces had been prepared for an inspection and not necessarily being manned at the state that they would have been. So it was an unfortunate twist of fate.
Privates Joseph Lockhart and George Elliott were on watch at the Army's radar post on Opana Mountain. At the end of their shift, suddenly a very large return appeared on their display. Only a very large airborne group could cause such a return. There was no time to waste. At 7:06, they reported their findings. A very large signal due north 137 miles out. To the watch officer, a young lieutenant at the information center.
Excuse me, sir, this is Private Lockhart. I believe a large flight of planes are approaching slightly east of north of Oahu at a distance of about 130 miles.
Lieutenant Kermit Tyler was told by an aviation friend of his, hey, if you ever hear the music playing at 3 a.m., it's because we're expecting an incoming flight of aircraft from the mainland. So when he got in his vehicle that morning to come to work, turned on his radio, there was music playing. Normally it would have been static because they didn't pay DJs to play music at 2, 3, 4 in the morning. So he knew that they were using that as a way to allow incoming pilots to hone in on Hawaiian Islands, given the navigational challenges of flying 2,500 miles across open ocean.
Rather infamously, the officer told them it was most likely a flight of B-17s inbound from California. Don't worry about it.
Thank you, sir.
lot of their aviators thought this was their final mission. They didn't believe that it would be a complete and total surprise the way it was. Of course, so the heroism just to get in the cockpit, you know, I think if you're an 18 or 19 or 20-year-old aviator and know that you're flying off of a ship 200 miles from an island, 3,000 miles from your homeland, I can't imagine what that would have been like for them.
The targets of the torpedo bombers and Kate bombers were 7 battleships that were moored in the Battleship Row near Ford Island. 51 dive bombers were ordered to bomb air bases Hickam and Wheeler and Ford Island. That airborne attack was to be supported by 43 Zero fighters. Apart from the aforementioned air bases, the fighters also had to attack airfields Ewa and Kaneohe.
At 7:55, the crews of the ships were preparing to raise the colors. On Nevada, they will be accompanied by the ship's band, 23 personnel, including the conductor. At 7:58, the conductor noticed aircraft coming in over the harbor, and shortly thereafter, the line of ships was rocked by underwater explosions. Nevertheless, at 8 a.m. sharp, the band began to play the national anthem.
The memories of those sailors who survived the attack describe that first terrifying assault the best.
Aviation metalsmith second class Adolf Kuhn on Ford Island. A Japanese pilot swooped down low in front of me where I could see his bomb bay doors open. He released a huge bomb heading straight for my tractor.
I said to myself, Adolf, this is it for sure. With my foot on my brake and hands on top of my head like I did in the little crowded boat earlier. I prayed again. After all, I'd missed mass this morning. I saw the bomb into the concrete runway, ripping out huge chunks of cement lace and reinforcing steel, which landed on nearby rooftops and equipment, while smaller pieces hit my tractor and bounced off, some hitting my arm and shoulder. Again, I thanked my guardian angel.
Sigelman second class Richard E. Burge, USS Tennessee. I watched the fleet destroyed right before my eyes.
I watched the fleet destroyed right before my eyes. The USS Arizona was anchored 50 feet to the stern of our ship. She took several bombs and torpedoes, raised up, and quickly sank to the bottom of the harbor. USS West Virginia and USS Oklahoma took several torpedoes. The West Virginia sank alongside us. The USS Oklahoma, which was anchored forward of the West Virginia, capsized completely.
The USS Maryland, anchored forward of us, took a bomb and its bow sank.
People often want to know what damage was received in the first few minutes of the air raid, and the answer to that is it was quite a lot. In fact, the surprise is one of the fundamentals of war, and the Japanese used that with overwhelming success. You have to remember this: the aircraft carrier had never been used before the way that enemy aviation was being used against the United States on December 7th, 1941. So they didn't really feel like it was a practical possibility for there to be an airborne attack against Oahu.
It was raid planner and first wave commander Mitsuo Fuchida who had sent the signal Tora, Tora, Tora to the carrier Akagi. This signal meant two things. First, complete surprise had been attained. And second, World War II had just expanded to the Pacific. of December 1941, 0758, the following message was transmitted to all ships in the Hawaii area. It would then, of course, be forwarded on to the commanders of the Atlantic and Asiatic fleets and the Commander-in-Chief in Washington, D.C. Air raid on Pearl Harbor. This is not drill.
I was 4 or 5 feet into the Joe mess when the first torpedo hit. It was an explosion I will never forget. The noise was a very well-muffled blast. You could tell it was deep in the bottom of the ship, as the ship was lifted rapidly straight off a considerable distance. I don't think it would be far off in estimating it as 24 to 30 inches. My legs almost buckled, and I reached out my arms to avoid being thrown to the deck.
I did not fall, but I caught myself and then knew for sure that this was no drill. The day of infamy had arrived. Ensign Adolph D. Mortensen, USS Oklahoma.
At 8:10 a.m., when the commander of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, Admiral Husband Kimmel, arrived at HQ, the main forces of his fleet had been already forced out of action.
Admiral Kimmel and Admiral Short had a golf match planned for later Sunday morning. So he was most likely, just like everyone else, completely surprised. What I found most interesting in my research that happened when it comes to Admiral Kimmel's response to the attack was, as he sat in his headquarters, which overlooks Pearl Harbor here, he was watching the decimation of his fleet. And a spent American anti-aircraft round actually came back, pierced the window he was looking through, and smudged his Navy white uniform. And he looked down at the time, and it's reported that he said, "It would have been better had it killed me."
By that time, 3 battleships, Arizona, Oklahoma, and West Virginia, had already been sunk. California was still afloat, but she was doomed. Maryland and Tennessee had been damaged by aerial bombs and were blocked by a ship that had been moored nearby and then ran aground. Nevada was hit by a torpedo, but she still attempted to start moving. Ships located on the other side of Ford Island were damaged as well. Despite all that hell, the ship crews were organizing their defenses and opening fire in return.
Man your battle stations was echoed amongst the fleet. So those that were available rushed to their battle stations. And it's one of my favorite stories because there was an American priest, a chaplain, religious service member, who was working on an American ship. He encouraged his shipmates by saying to them, "Everyone praise the Lord, but please pass the ammunition." Yes, there was a lot of confusion at first, but following the initial attack, the American response was much higher.
This is the USS Oklahoma Memorial. Each one of these columns represents a sailor who was killed on just that one ship on the morning of December 7th, 41. Once the initial shock and surprise of the attack had been gotten over, the sailors manned their systems and started to fight back. There are various stories of determination. For example, there was a sailor aboard USS Maryland who had been put into the brig for fighting the night before. Well, they released him when the alarm was sounded, and he started carrying shells up ladders until finally he collapsed to the deck unconscious.
Dory Miller, who's a famous African-American who received the Navy Cross because he was called to the bridge of the West Virginia to remove the wounded captain. He was mortally wounded. The captain subsequently refused to be removed from the bridge. So Dory Miller thought, well, hey, while I'm up here, I might as well do something. He went outside and started operating an anti-aircraft machine gun that he had never been trained on.
The second attack started at 7:15 a.m. 54 bombers, 78 dive bombers, and 35 fighters took off. 36 more fighters remained on the carriers to provide cover on Admiral Nagumo's orders.
very important to the Japanese aviators that they neutralized the PBYs and amphibious planes from being able to go and find their task force. First bomb that was dropped on Ford Island eventually burned a hangar that had a very large number of PBYs out front. Other targets included airfields because they didn't, for the same reason, they didn't want heavy bombers or any aircraft getting off the ground and locating the fleet. Just one plane discovering where the fleet the Japanese fleet had launched the planes from would have been a catastrophe, because then the U.S. forces would know where to intercept them or to attempt to sink them.
That morning at Hickam Field, you'd find 12 B-17 bombers, 12 A-20 bombers, 30 older B-18 bombers. The Japanese would destroy most of the American aircraft on the ground, either in the hangars or out on the airfield itself.
Okay, masyado ng maraming kwento dun sa pag-atake ng Japan sa Pearl Harbor. So ngayon, another documentary film, a documentary clip featuring the Japanese attack in the Philippines, the Japanese invasion of the Philippines in 1941.
The Philippines was conducted on schedule. The first landing was made on December 8th. And during the 2 weeks following, beachheads were successfully secured at 6 points in the archipelago. The Nipponese assault troops had been well prepared for this kind of campaign. On Luzon, the principal island, the strategy called for the forces which had landed at several points to drive toward Manila and seize that objective. The main strength in that push was provided by the assault group which invaded the island at Lingayen Gulf, 110 miles from Manila, across central Luzon. By Christmas, Japanese invasions had been made at 9 points in the Philippines, and the campaign to seize control of this important strategic area was well underway. After a thorough softening up process, the invaders pressed onward toward Manila, and what they hoped would be a quick victory on Luzon. During the first weeks of fighting on Luzon, the Japanese steadily reinforced their original assault units. As 1941 neared its end, the Japanese were succeeding in closing in on Manila from 2 directions. The Japanese plan for choking off the Philippine capital was working perfectly. Nipponese planes began bombing Manila in early December. The air attacks continued as the invading ground forces drew closer to the Philippine capital. The Japanese raids on U.S. airfields took a heavy toll of U.S. planes, many destroyed on the ground. At year's end, advanced Japanese units approached within sight of Manila, which was still bombed, though it had been declared an open city. In little more than 3 weeks, the spearhead of the Japanese ground offensive on the capital had driven within striking distance of the objective. Evacuated by its defenders, Manila was the invaders for the taking. The Philippine capital passed into the hands of the enemy on January 2nd, 1942. The Nipponese claimed they were liberating the island. But most Filipinos scarcely considered it liberation. Japanese propaganda units went into action at once, spreading the doctrine of Asia for the Asiatics. Are we not all of the Far East, they asked? The advantages of life in the greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere were dinned into the consciousness of Filipinos of all ages.
Mga kababayan, ang mga Hapon ay hindi nating kalaban.
Some Filipinos helped the Japanese in their campaign. In Manila's streets, Filipino collaborationists spoke to their countrymen in Tagalog, a Philippine native tongue. The conquerors blamed the Philippines' troubles on the U.S. But their campaign was not an overwhelming success. Most Filipinos remained unconvinced. They remembered the story of Japanese rule in China and Manchuria. The Greater East Asia propaganda continued throughout the occupation, but it needed strong backing. In mid-March, with the enemy in control of almost all of Luzon, General Douglas MacArthur, the American commander, left the island on orders from Washington and assumed new duties in Australia. The general arrived on the down-under continent to take over the preparations for mounting an offensive against the enemy at the earliest opportunity. In Manila, the start of the Japanese occupation was celebrated by the invaders with a parade through the center of the city. The seizure of the Philippine capital gave the Nipponese more satisfaction than most of their other conquests. Most gratified of all was the Japanese commander, General Masaharu Homma, to whom this day was one of the most memorable of his military career. General Homma would have found it hard to believe that this city, whose people regularly paid him deference on Japanese proclaimed holidays, would 4 years later be the setting for his execution for war crimes. But during early 1942, it was hard for the Filipinos to see beyond the Japanese occupation, to visualize their country again free from the yoke of the conqueror. Under Japanese rule, some Filipinos openly collaborated with the invaders. In late April 1942, Corregidor in Manila Bay was the last outpost to resist the Japanese invaders of Luzon. For almost a month, the Japanese bombarded the island fortress with every weapon at their command. Finally, on May 5th, 1942, Japanese assault units crossed the narrow channel separating Luzon from Corregidor and stormed the rock's sturdy defenses. After nearly 24 hours, fighting on the island ceased on May 6th. That afternoon, General Jonathan Wainwright, the American commander, met with General Homma on nearby Bataan Peninsula to effect the surrender. At first, the American commander surrendered only those forces on Corregidor and neighboring islets in Manila Bay, but not the American units still fighting the Japanese elsewhere in the Philippines. Later, however, General Wainwright was forced to surrender all his Philippine units, and in a tremulous voice, he announced his action to them over the Japanese-controlled radio. The historic statement was recorded by the gloating conquerors.
It is Lieutenant General J.M. Wainwright. To put a stop to further useless sacrifice of human life on the fortified islands, and today I tendered to Lieutenant General Homma, the Commander-in-Chief of the Imperial Japanese Forces in the Philippines, the formal surrender of all American and Philippine Army troops in the Philippine Islands. This decision, on my part, you will realize, was forced upon me by means entirely beyond my control.
General Homma, the Beast of Bataan, soon set out to visit the scene of the epic battle for the island fortress. After a difficult campaign which had lasted 5 months, the invaders had finally succeeded in overpowering the remnants of the American Luzon force. The final battle had been one of the most bitterly fought defenses in history. The victorious Japanese inspected the area with interest. The valiant stand made by the U.S. 4th Marine Regiment, with a mixture of soldiers, sailors, and Filipinos attached, will never be forgotten by the Japanese who participated in the battle for Corregidor. The victors were especially curious about the weapons which had caused them so much trouble before the assault troops overran the island's defenses. After the capture of Corregidor, the Japanese quickly gained control of all the Philippines. In the United States, a month later, the Philippine Commonwealth government was represented by its president in exile, Manuel Quezon. The first steps toward Philippine independence, so hopefully planned 7 years earlier in Washington, had received a staggering setback. But with the support of the United States,
Okay, so back to discussion. Okay, so again, main feature ng pag-atake ng isa sa mga main highlight ng pag-atake ng Japan sa Pilipinas ay ang pagbagsak ng Bataan at Corregidor. Okay, so December 8 of 1941 when Japan attacked the Philippines, then for months of continuous fight, continuous resistance ng mga Pilipino at mga Amerikanong sundalo, noong April 9, 1942, bumagsak ang Bataan. So ngayon, kino-commemorate natin ang April 9 bilang araw ng kagitingan or Day of Valor, no? To commemorate the heroic deed of our heroes who died fighting during the Japanese occupation in the Philippines. Okay? So let's move forward. So isa sa mga highlight din ng pagbagsak ng Bataan at Corregidor ay ang famous na Death March. No? Ano ang Death March? This is the forcible transfer by the Imperial Japanese Army of 60,000 to 80,000 American and Filipino prisoners of war from Saysayin Point in Bagak, Bataan and Mariveles to Camp O'Donnell in Capas, Tarlac via San Fernando, Pampanga. So dito sa famous Death March na ito, 5,000 hanggang 18,000 Pilipino ang namatay, habang may 500 hanggang 650 Amerikano naman ang nasawi dito sa Death March na ito. So usually yung mga namamatay dito, yung mga nagtatakang tumakas, yung mga napapagod habang naglalakad, then binabaril na lamang sila ng mga Japanese soldiers. Then meron din maraming cases din dito na tumatakas yung mga Pilipinong sundalo, at yung mga tumakas na mga Pilipinong sundalo na yun dineklarang patay. Then nagugulat na lamang yung mga kamag-anak nila na after ng war, nag-uuwian yung mga dineklarang patay ng mga Pilipino na yun. So may mga ilang misdeclaration din na nangyari ng mga panahon na yan. Okay, next. Bakit nga ba sumalakay ang Japan sa Pilipinas? So again, bahagi ito ng kanyang imperyo, no? Yung tinawag na Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. So this is an imperialist concept which was developed in the Empire of Japan and propagated to Asian populations which were occupied by it from 1931 to 1945. Ang pinaka-konsepto nito or pinaka-philosophy nito ay yung self-sufficient bloc ng Asian nations. Kumbaga Asia for Asians. No? In Tagalog, Asia para sa mga Asyano. An Asia free from the rule of Western powers. Kung papakinggan natin, napakaganda sana ng propaganda ng Japan, but the way it was being implemented, the way kung paano nila sinimulan itong Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, ito yung hindi naging katanggap-tanggap sa mga tao. No, kasi kung tunay nga nilang layunin na i-liberate tayo sa mga Western powers, sana hindi nila tayo sinaktan, hindi nila pinagpapatay yung mga kababayan natin ng mga panahon na yan. Okay, though this promoted the cultural and economic unity of Northeast Asians, Southeast Asians, South Asians, and Oceanians. Maganda ang propaganda pero hindi maganda yung paraan nila ng pagpapakalat ng kanilang propaganda. Actually, hindi nakalimutan ng mga tao yung ginawang yan ng Japan. For example, in Korea, di ba? One case is Korea. Hanggang ngayon, galit marami pa rin mga Koreans ang galit sa mga Hapon. Okay? So next. So, in Philippine politics, no, itatatag ang kalibapi or yung kapisanan ng paglilingkod sa bagong Pilipinas. So this kalibapi functioned as a single political party in the Philippines after the Japanese military administration had forced all other parties to dissolve. So ito yung Japanese-sponsored political party sa Pilipinas. Okay? Then in lieu with this kalibapi, itatatag nila ang puppet government. No, yung Kalibapi government na kung saan si Jose P. Laurel ang ia-appoint nila bilang Pangulo ng Pilipinas. No, kino-consider na isang de facto government itong puppet government na ito, though kasi hindi ito kinikilala ng international community. Next. Okay, so bakit nandito si Emilio Aguinaldo? Another sad story created by Emilio Aguinaldo was that nakipag-collaborate siya sa mga Hapon. No, ano yung storya ni Aguinaldo no ikalawang digmaang pandaigdig, no? Hinihikayat niya na sumuko na ang mga Pilipino at kilalanin ang mga Hapon bilang mga pinuno. No, sinasabi rin ni Aguinaldo sa mga tao noon, nananawagan siya na ang tunay nating kalaban ay mga Amerikano at ang mga Hapon ay kaibigan natin. Well, Aguinaldo, a classic political butterfly. No, na kung saan siya nakikinabang, saan siya okay, doon siya. Okay, so dito itatatag ni Emilio Aguinaldo yung samahan na tinatawag na Makapili. Ano po yung Makapili? So ito yung samahan ng mga Pilipino na ituturo, no, sa mga sundalong Hapon yung mga gerilya na lumalaban sa mga Hapon. So isa na namang act of betrayal na naman ang ginawa nito ni Emilio Aguinaldo. Iyon. The classic Aguinaldo. Nung kulang na lang tawagin siyang political prostitute. No, noong mga panahon na yan. Okay. So nasaan si Manuel L. Quezon nung panahon na yan? Siya ay nasa government in exile, whereas ito yung tinatawag nating de jure government. Though it is the legitimate government, no, ng Pilipinas, pero wala ito sa Pilipinas kasi standard operating procedure na in times of war kailangang ialis ang pangulo sa kanyang bansa at dalhin sa kaalyadong bansa para siya ay maprotektahan. Okay nga lang, syempre dahil sa digmaan, no, magkakaroon ng kontrobersyal na extension sa kapangyarihan nitong si Manuel Quezon sapagkat by 1940, 'di ba na-elect siya ulit ng 1939. So plus 4, dapat bababa na siya sa kapangyarihan ng 1943. Since wala namang eleksyon na magaganap sa Pilipinas ng 1943, he extended his power hanggang sa yung siya ay pangulo ng Pilipinas hanggang sa namatay siya sa sakit na tuberculosis noong 1944. Yan, namatay si Quezon sa Amerika sa sakit na tuberculosis. No, sa Saranac Lake sa New York. Okay? So, sa pagkatapos, natapusin natin kaagad itong World War II na ito. Sa pagkatapos ng World War II, napakadami or napakalaki ng casualty na dinanas ng Pilipinas under the Japanese rule. In record, pangalawa tayo sa Poland, sa bansang Poland, sa pinaka-devastated na mga bansa nung panahon ng ikalawang digmaang pandaigdig. No? In Poland, they recorded the 7 million deaths, no, sa kanilang bansa, while in the Philippines, we recorded almost 2 million deaths, no, nung panahon ng ikalawang digmaang pandaigdig. At of course, yung pagkatapos ng ikalawang digmaang pandaigdig isa na namang issue kasi sa Pilipinas kasi ninakaw na naman ng mga Amerikano yung credit sa mga Pilipino ng pagkatalo sa Hapon. Actually, bago pa dumating ang mga American soldiers sa pamumuno ni General Douglas MacArthur, halos lahat ng mga lugar sa Pilipinas ay na-liberate na ng mga guerrillas. No, then by the latter part of 1944, babalik sa Pilipinas si General Douglas MacArthur para daw i-fulfill nga yung kanyang pangako sa mga Pilipino na I shall return. Okay, so where is General Tomoyuki Yamashita? Ito po si General Yamashita. No, nagtago sila sa Kiangan, Ifugao nung mga panahon na yan. At hanggang sa sila ay na-annihilate ng combined guerrilla and US forces. No, nagtago ito sa Ifugao sa mountain sa Cordillera region kaya't nabuo yung myth or yung sabi-sabi na may tinatawag daw na Yamashita treasure. Actually, kung ako tatanungin nyo, wala. No, hindi ako naniniwalang may Yamashita treasure. Okay, so ba't nga itatago sa Pilipinas yung mga treasure niya? Okay. Ayun, no? So, before we proceed with the liberation of the Philippines, meron tayong papanoorin na maikling documentary tungkol naman sa isa sa mga atrocities na ginawa ng Japan sa Pilipinas, no? Which will be called yung mga comfort women. No, yung mga babaeng Pilipina na ginawang sexual toy ng mga Japanese soldiers. Okay, saglit.
Would just be a fraction of the many victims of rape who are afraid to speak out because of fear, trauma, and shame. The Philippines never run out of sensational rape cases in the past. The Magdalena story, the Antonio Santos rape case, the Chong murders, and the Vizconde massacre. And the reason why they are sensational? The victims were gang raped. But perhaps the most gruesome gang rape in Philippine history happened more than 75 years ago. The victims were not just one, not 10, not even 100, but more than 1,000 women were raped, tortured, and mutilated by an army of Japanese soldiers. So, who are they? They are the Filipino comfort women. They became the sex slaves of the Japanese Imperial Army during their occupation of the Philippines in the 1940s. What would it be like to be a Filipino comfort woman? How would you deal with being raped by more than 50 soldiers every day? And where are they now? This is Filipino Acts. What if? And here's what would happen if you were gang raped by the Japanese Imperial Army during the Second World War. Occupation of the Philippines occurred from 1942 to 1945, when Imperial Japan occupied the Philippines during World War II. Even though the Japanese period only lasted for 3 years, the misery suffered by the Filipinos was unfathomable. And how was life back then? Life then was at its most difficult because of the widespread famine. Life was unbearable, and they would often say that it's cheaper to buy a child than to buy a pig. Was the most feared by many Filipinos. They specialized in interrogation and were known for their brutality. The chance of you surviving the torture is almost zero. You would be beaten heavily, drowned in water, burned alive, electrocuted, your limbs dislocated, and you would be forced to eat your own shit. And that's human cruelty at its finest. And perhaps the most sensational part of the Japanese occupation is the more than 1,000 Filipino women who were forced to sex slavery. They were called the comfort women, and if you were one, you would be forced to live in comfort station houses. No, you were not a prostitute. You would have been a loving mother, a caring sister, and a sweet teenage child. The gang rape committed by the Japanese Filipinas did not happen by accident. It is but rather an organized and arranged sexual slavery system that is unique only to the Japanese Imperial Army. I'm intrigued. Tell me more. Any army around the world usually has brothels and prostitutes, but the Japanese has this enforced sexual slavery system. Oh, why do they need to have one? Comfort women's stations had to be secured to prevent espionage and spread of venereal disease. If the soldiers would go to the brothels, there is always this danger that the prostitutes have a link to the guerrilla resistance movements, and comfort stations are more secured and watched over, so the danger of the military information leaking them out is very unlikely. The system was structured and routinized. Every month, a doctor would come around to check on you as a comfort woman to see if you are still good for the stations or not. Let's just say it's their quality assurance check. Just checking if the victims are still fresh. The setup of the comfort women system followed a rigid algorithm, so methodical and systematized. Alright, in English please. Like into a canteen, the hours of operation are strictly regulated. In the morning, the soldiers and privates would take turns in raping the women. In the afternoon, the corporals and the sergeants. And in the evening, it's the officers.